The knife was already at her throat before Elara opened her eyes. She did not scream. She had trained herself for 8 long years never to make a sound, not even now, with a stranger's hand pressed against her mouth and cold steel resting against her skin in the dark of her small room. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure the man could hear it, but her lips stayed sealed, and her breath came out slow and silent through her nose, the way she had practiced 1,000 times. "Don't move," the man whispered. His voice was rough, unfamiliar, laced with the low growl of a wolf, barely holding his shift at bay. "I know what you are hiding, little mute girl. I know your secret." For one terrible moment, Elara believed her secret was finally over. 8 years of silence, gone in an instant, because a stranger had broken into her home in the middle of the night, with a blade against her neck. Her mind raced through every possible outcome, and none of them were good. If her secret came out this way, in blood and fear, there would be no time to explain, no time to run, no time to choose her own fate ever again. Then the door of her room burst open with a force that shook the walls, and a shape moved faster than her eyes could follow. There was a sound like thunder crashing inside a small space, a snarl that did not belong to any ordinary man, and then the knife was gone from her throat, and the stranger was gone from the room, thrown backward through the broken window, as though he weighed nothing at all. Elara sat frozen on her bed, gasping silently, her hand pressed to her throat where the blade had rested seconds before. Standing in the wreckage of her doorway, chest heaving, eyes burning gold in the darkness, was the last man in the world she wanted looking at her this closely. Alpha King Kalen Voss. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not ask what had happened. His gaze swept over her once, taking in every detail: the torn collar of her nightclothes, the thin red line at her neck, the wide, unblinking fear in her eyes. Then he turned, stepped through the shattered window frame, and disappeared into the night after the intruder, leaving nothing behind but the smell of rain and the echo of a growl that still seemed to vibrate in the walls. Elara did not move for a long time. She had spent 8 years making herself invisible. 8 years of silence so complete that even the pack healers had stopped checking her throat for injury, certain that whatever had taken her voice was permanent, untouchable, beyond even magic to heal. She had built her entire existence around one simple rule: never speak, never be noticed, never be claimed. And in one single night, a stranger with a knife and an Alpha King with fire in his eyes had both looked at her as though they saw straight through the wall she had spent years building. She rose from the bed on shaking legs and walked to the broken window, looking out into the dark forest beyond the pack houses. Somewhere out there, the Alpha King was hunting the man who had come for her. She did not know why anyone would want to hurt her. A lowly Omega who did not speak, who kept to the kitchens and the laundry rooms, who asked for nothing and expected less. She had no enemies, because she made sure never to matter enough to anyone to earn one. Or so she had believed until tonight. The pack medic arrived within minutes, a kind older woman named Marla who had tended to Elara's small injuries more times than either of them could count over the years. Marla examined the thin cut at her throat with gentle hands, murmuring reassurances that Elara could not answer, though she nodded when needed and shook her head when appropriate, the same silent language she had used for so long that it had become as natural as breathing. "You are lucky," Marla said, dabbing a healing salve along the wound. "An inch deeper, and we would not be having this conversation at all." She paused, studying Elara's face with the sharp attention of someone who had known her a long time. "Do you have any idea who that man was? Any idea why he would come for you?" Elara shook her head. It was the truth, as far as she understood it. She had no idea who the intruder was. But she had heard the words he whispered before the Alpha King arrived, and those words echoed now in her mind, with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "I know what you are hiding." Someone knew. Someone besides herself had realized that her silence was not what it seemed. The rest of the night passed in a blur of hushed activity. Guards were posted outside her window. The broken glass was cleared away. She was moved, without being consulted, to a room closer to the center of the pack house, a room with thick walls and only one door, a room that felt less like protection and more like a cage with better furniture. She lay on the unfamiliar bed, long after the pack house fell silent again, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night over and over. She thought of the Alpha King's eyes when he had looked at her, just for that single moment before he chased the intruder into the dark. There had been something in that look that unsettled her more than the knife ever had. Not pity. Not simple concern for an injured pack member. Something closer to recognition, as though he had been searching for something and had, without warning, found it in the last place he expected. Elara pressed her palms against her closed eyes and forced herself to breathe slowly, the way she always did when the fear threatened to overwhelm her. She could not let herself hope, or fear, or wonder about the Alpha King's gaze. She had learned long ago that hope was dangerous for a girl like her. Hope made you careless. Hope made you forget the rules that kept you safe. But sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, her dreams were filled with golden eyes and the sound of her own name spoken aloud in a voice she had not used in 8 years. Morning arrived gray and quiet, rain still falling in a steady rhythm against the windows of the pack house. Elara rose before the sun was fully up, her body accustomed to years of waking early to begin the day's work, before anyone else stirred. It was one of the few habits she still allowed herself, a small ritual of control, in a life that often felt as though it belonged to everyone but her. She dressed carefully, checking the mirror to be certain the thin scar at her throat was hidden beneath her collar, and made her way toward the kitchens, where she had worked since she was young enough that no one remembered a time before her silence. The other kitchen workers greeted her the way they always did, with small nods and gentle smiles, none of them expecting a response, and none of them offended when they did not receive one. It was a comfortable rhythm, a life built entirely around the absence of her voice, and for 8 years, it had been enough to keep her safe. But today, as she moved through the familiar motions of preparing the morning meal, she felt eyes on her that had never been there before. She caught pack members glancing her way, and then quickly looking elsewhere when she noticed. Word of the attack had clearly spread through the pack overnight, faster than any official announcement could have traveled. By mid-morning, the whispers had grown loud enough that even someone who spent her life pretending not to hear anything could not ignore them entirely. They say the Alpha King himself broke down her door, one of the younger kitchen girls whispered to another, believing Elara was too far away to hear, or perhaps simply forgetting, as everyone eventually did, that a mute girl could still listen perfectly well. Why would he come running for her? She's nobody. Maybe he heard the intruder from his own quarters, the other girl reasoned. It's not like he came for her specifically. Elara kept her head down and continued her work, though the words settled into her chest with an uncomfortable weight. She's nobody. It was exactly the reputation she had spent 8 years cultivating, the exact impression she needed the pack to hold of her if she wanted to remain unclaimed, unremarkable, safe. And yet last night, for reasons she could not explain, the most powerful man in the territory had crashed through her window like the world was ending, and she was the only thing worth saving. She did not have long to sit with these thoughts before one of the pack's senior guards appeared at the kitchen entrance, his expression grave, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. "Elara," he said, his tone carrying the particular gentleness people used when speaking to someone they believed could not truly understand the weight of their words. "The Alpha King requests your presence in his study. Now, if you please." The kitchen fell silent around her. Every eye in the room turned in her direction, and she felt the full weight of their curiosity pressing against her skin, like a physical thing. She wiped her hands on her apron, nodded once to show she understood, and followed the guard out of the kitchen and into the long corridor that led toward the heart of the pack house, toward the part of the building she had never once had reason to enter in all her years of quiet service. Her mind raced with possibilities as she walked, each one worse than the last. Perhaps the Alpha King wanted to question her about the attack, and she would have to find some way to communicate without speaking, some elaborate performance of gestures and written notes that would only draw more attention to her than she had ever wanted. Perhaps he had somehow already guessed her secret, and this summons was simply the formal unveiling of 8 years of careful deception. Perhaps he intended to claim her himself, seeing in the previous night's events some twisted justification for taking what he wanted, the way so many alphas before him had taken from omegas who had no power to refuse. By the time she reached the heavy wooden doors of the Alpha King's study, her hands were trembling, though she kept them clasped tightly together to hide the shaking. The guard knocked once, received a low command to enter, and pushed the doors open before stepping aside to let her pass through alone. The study was larger than she had expected, lined with shelves of old books and maps of territories she had never seen, a fire burning low in a wide stone hearth despite the gray morning light filtering through tall windows. Kalen Voss stood near the window with his back to her, his broad shoulders tense beneath a simple dark shirt, his hands clasped behind him in a posture that seemed to hold both authority and restlessness in equal measure. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and the soft patter of rain against the glass. Ilara stood just inside the doorway, uncertain whether to approach further or wait for some signal, her pulse hammering loud enough that she wondered if his wolf hearing could pick it up from across the room. Finally he turned, and his golden eyes found hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something in her refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. It was not phrased as a request, but there was less command in it than she had expected from a man of his reputation. She moved to the chair and sat, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. "I caught the man who attacked you," Kalen said, watching her face carefully as he spoke, as though searching for some particular reaction. "He will not be troubling you again, but before I dealt with him, he said something curious. He said he had been hired, paid well, by someone within our own territory, to silence a girl who was never truly silent at all." Ilara's breath caught, though she forced her expression to remain calm, blank, the careful mask she had perfected over years of practice. She kept her eyes fixed on his, refusing to let them dart away in the manner that might betray guilt. "I find that an interesting choice of words," Kalen continued, moving closer, until he stood only a few feet from her chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the coolness of the room. "Silence a girl who was never truly silent. It made me wonder, Ilara, what exactly it is that you have been hiding from all of us for 8 years. She held perfectly still, her mind working furiously to construct some plausible response, using only her hands and her expression, some way to deflect the question, without confirming or denying anything. But before she could attempt any gesture, Kalen crouched down in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and his voice dropped to something quieter, gentler, though no less certain. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. "I am not going to force you to do anything. But I think you understand every word I am saying right now, and I think you have understood every word spoken around you for a very long time. I felt it last night, when I broke through your window. I felt something in you recognize me, something that goes beyond simple relief at being rescued. My wolf has been restless for years, searching for something I could never name. Last night, for the first time, it went quiet, the moment I laid eyes on you." Ilara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She wanted to deny everything, to shake her head and play the role she had perfected, but some deeper instinct held her frozen, caught between the safety of silence and the terrifying pull of being truly seen for the first time in 8 years. "I am not asking you to speak," Kalen said softly, watching the war playing out behind her eyes. "Not yet, but I want you to know that whatever reason drove you to silence, whatever fear made you build these walls, I intend to understand it, and I intend to keep you safe while I do, whether you choose to trust me or not." He rose to his feet then, stepping back to give her space, though his eyes never left her face. "You will move into the guest chambers near my own quarters, effective today. You will have guards with you at all times, until we determine who ordered the attack on your life. This is not a request, Ilara. This is for your protection." Ilara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could return to her small room and her simple, invisible life, that all of this attention was the very thing she had spent 8 years trying to avoid. But she had no voice to argue with, and even if she had, some quiet part of her recognized the truth in his words. Someone in the pack wanted her silenced permanently, and whatever secret she had been protecting for 8 years had apparently already begun to unravel, whether she was ready or not. She nodded, once, in silent agreement, and rose from the chair to follow the path he had already decided for her, uncertain whether she was walking toward safety or toward the very exposure she had spent nearly a decade running from. As she left the study, she allowed herself one glance back. Kalen stood by the window again, watching the rain, his expression unreadable, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested a man who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle he had been solving his entire life, and did not yet know whether the picture it completed would bring him joy or ruin. Ilara walked the long corridor back toward the guest chambers, with her mind spinning through possibilities she had refused to consider for 8 years. Someone had ordered her death, or her silence permanently, and the Alpha King himself believed she was more than she appeared to be. For the first time since the night she chose to stop speaking, she felt the fragile architecture of her hidden life beginning to crack, and she had no idea whether what waited on the other side would be freedom, or the very danger she had spent so long trying to escape. The guest chambers were larger and finer than anything she had ever slept in, with soft furnishings and a window that overlooked the training grounds where pack warriors practiced beneath the gray morning sky. 2 guards took their positions outside her door, silent sentries who nodded to her with respect she was unaccustomed to receiving. She sat on the edge of the wide bed, staring at her own hands, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to remember why she had chosen this path 8 years ago. She remembered the sound of screaming that had never quite left her memory, the sight of a girl not much older than herself, dragged before the pack council, and claimed against every wish she had voiced, silenced not by choice, but by force, her protests meaning nothing, against the will of an alpha who decided her voice was an inconvenience to his authority. Ilara had been young then, watching from the shadows where children were meant to remain unseen, and she had promised herself that no one would ever have the chance to silence her that way. If she gave up her voice willingly, completely, permanently, no one could ever take it from her as a punishment for daring to use it. It had seemed, at the time, like the only way to remain in control of her own fate. But now, sitting in a chamber she had never asked for, guarded by men she had never requested, summoned by an Alpha King who claimed his wolf recognized something in her that she had buried so deep she barely remembered it herself, Ilara wondered for the first time in 8 years whether her careful silence had ever truly protected her at all, or whether it had simply been another kind of cage, one she had built with her own hands and locked from the inside. Outside her window, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the pack house, the Alpha King sat with his suspicions and his restless wolf, already beginning to unravel the threads of a secret that had taken 8 long years to weave. 3 days passed before Ilara saw the Alpha King again. 3 days spent inside the unfamiliar comfort of the guest chambers, watched over by guards who treated her with a caution that bordered on reverence. She used the time to think, to plan, to remember every detail of the night that had changed the course of her entire life 8 years ago, searching for any thread that might explain why someone within her own pack would want her dead now, after so many years of being nothing more than a quiet shadow in the kitchens. She found no answers on her own, and the isolation of the guest chambers began to wear on her in ways she had not expected. She had grown used to the rhythm of kitchen work, the comfort of familiar faces who asked nothing of her, the small satisfaction of being useful in a way that did not require her voice. Here, in this fine room with its soft bed and tall windows, she had nothing to occupy her hands or her mind, except the endless circle of her own fears. So when a young guard named Teddy knocked on her door on the 4th morning and told her the Alpha King wished her to join him for the midday meal, she felt something close to relief, despite the anxiety that came with it. She followed Teddy through corridors she was beginning to recognize, past the study where she had first been summoned, into a smaller dining room she had not seen before, decorated simply but elegantly, a single table set for 2, near a window that looked out over gardens just beginning to bloom with the last of the season's flowers. Kalen was already seated when she arrived, though he rose the moment she entered, a small courtesy that surprised her more than she expected it to. "Thank you for joining me," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. She sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap, watching him with the wary attention of someone who had learned long ago never to let her guard down completely, no matter how gentle a man's words might seem. For a while, they ate in silence, though it was not the comfortable silence she was accustomed to in the kitchens. This silence felt charged, heavy with unspoken questions, and she was aware of Kalen watching her with an intensity that made every small movement feel significant, every glance loaded with meaning she could not fully decipher. "I have been asking questions," he said finally, setting down his utensils and studying her face. "About the night 8 years ago, when you stopped speaking. Most of the pack remembers very little. They say you simply grew quiet after a fever, or an injury, though no one can quite agree on the details. It struck me as strange, how little anyone truly knows about what happened to you." Alara kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse quickened at his words. She had crafted that story herself, all those years ago, and had let it spread through the pack like a rumor with no clear origin, until everyone believed some version of it, without anyone being able to point to where it had begun. But I spoke with Marla, Kalen continued, his voice low, thoughtful. She examined you the night this all began, all those years ago. She told me there was no injury to your throat, no illness that could explain such a sudden and complete loss of voice. She always suspected something else was happening, something you chose rather than something that happened to you. She never pressed the matter, out of respect for whatever reason drove your choice. But I am less inclined toward such patience, Alara, not when someone within my own territory wants you dead. Alara set down her own utensils, her appetite gone entirely. She stared at the table, unwilling to meet his eyes, though she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing against her like a physical thing. I am not trying to trap you, Kalen said, his tone softening. I give you my word, whatever secret you carry, I will not use it against you. But I cannot protect you properly if I do not understand what I am protecting you from. Please, help me understand. She looked up at him then, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that his gentle words masked the same hunger for control that she had witnessed in so many alphas throughout her life. She found none. His golden eyes held nothing but genuine concern, and something else beneath it, something that looked almost like vulnerability, as though the powerful Alpha King feared her rejection as much as she feared his authority. She made a decision then, one that had been building inside her for days, without her fully realizing it. She reached for the small notepad and pencil that Marla had left in her room days ago, tools Alara had used occasionally over the years, for the rare moments when gesture alone could not convey what needed to be said. She had brought it with her today, tucked into the pocket of her dress, though she had not been certain she would use it. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote a single sentence and slid the notepad across the table toward him. I saw what happened to a girl who spoke against an alpha's wishes. Kalen read the words twice, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening, with something that looked like understanding mixed with anger, though she sensed the anger was not directed at her. Tell me, he said quietly. Tell me what you saw. Over the next hour, using the notepad and small gestures when words felt too heavy to write, Alara told him a version of the truth she had never shared with anyone. She wrote of a girl in her childhood pack, an Omega barely older than Alara had been at the time, claimed against her clear and desperate wishes by an Alpha, who decided her protests were simply a formality, to be overcome, rather than a boundary to be respected. She wrote of the girl's cries silenced not through comfort or reason, but through raw force, of the pack council that stood by and did nothing, of the moment Alara understood, with the terrible clarity that only children seem to possess, that a voice could be a target rather than a shield. She wrote that she had chosen silence, not because she could not speak, but because she believed, with the desperate logic of a frightened child, that a girl no one expected to speak was a girl no one would bother trying to silence by force. If she gave up her voice on her own terms, no one could ever take it from her as punishment. Kalen read every word with a stillness that Alara found both unsettling and strangely reassuring, as though he was containing some great force beneath a carefully controlled surface. When she finished writing, he was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the notepad, his hands clenched into fists on the table. That Alpha, he said finally, his voice low and rough. Does he still lead that pack? Alara shook her head, writing quickly. He died 3 years ago. Sickness, not violence. The pack has new leadership now, but I never returned there. My family moved territories after everything happened, hoping to leave the memory behind. And in all these years, Kalen said, you never told anyone why you chose silence. You let everyone believe it was something that happened to you, rather than something you chose. She nodded, and then, because the notepad felt suddenly insufficient for what she wanted to say, she found herself speaking for the first time in 8 years, her voice rusty and unfamiliar even to her own ears, barely above a whisper. If they knew I could speak, they would expect me to. And if I spoke, eventually I would say something someone did not want to hear. Silence was safer. Silence meant no one could punish me for using a voice I had chosen never to use again. The sound of her own voice in the quiet dining room felt like an earthquake, and she watched Kalen's expression shift through surprise, Then something warmer, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. "Your voice," he said softly, "is beautiful." Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she looked away, uncertain how to respond to a compliment so simple and so unexpected. She had not spoken aloud since that terrible night 8 years ago, had not allowed herself even in private moments, afraid that practicing her voice would make the temptation to use it too great to resist. Hearing it now, hearing Kaylin's genuine reaction to it, stirred something inside her that felt dangerously close to hope. "I understand now why you chose the path you did," Kaylin continued, his tone growing serious again. "But I need you to understand something in return. The man who attacked you said he had been paid to silence a girl who was never truly silent. That means someone within this pack, or someone with connections to it, already suspected the truth about your voice, long before you told me anything today. Which means your secret was never as safe as you believed." Alara's brief moment of warmth faded into renewed fear. If her secret had already reached dangerous ears before she confided in Kaylin, then the danger she faced had nothing to do with the trust she had just extended to him. Someone else, someone she could not yet identify, had been watching her closely enough to see through 8 years of careful performance. "Who would know?" she asked, her voice growing slightly stronger with use, though still quiet, still uncertain. "I have been so careful. I never speak, not even alone in my room. I write only when necessary, and I destroy anything I write, as soon as it has served its purpose." "Someone close to you," Kaylin said grimly. "Someone who has watched you long enough, closely enough, to notice the small details that would give you away." A reaction a fraction too quick, an expression that shows understanding a mute girl should not have. "I noticed these things myself, in the short time I have observed you. Someone else clearly noticed them too, and for reasons I do not yet understand, decided your voice was dangerous enough to warrant your death." The rest of the meal passed with little further conversation, both of them lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the morning's revelations settling heavily over the small dining room. When Alara finally rose to return to her chambers, Kaylin walked her to the door himself, dismissing the waiting guard for a moment of relative privacy. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with the truth. I know that could not have been easy, after so many years of guarding it so carefully." Alara looked up at him, searching his face once more, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, wanting to trust someone completely. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," Kaylin said, his expression hardening with resolve, "I find whoever ordered your death, and I make certain they never threaten you again. And in the meantime, I would like you to consider staying close to me. Not as a prisoner, and not out of obligation. My wolf recognized something in you the night I broke through your window. Something I have been searching for longer than you might imagine. I do not wish to force anything upon you that you do not choose freely. But I would like the chance to know you, Alara, as you truly are, rather than the version of yourself you have shown the world for 8 years." Alara felt the familiar instinct to retreat, to protect herself behind walls she had spent years building. But beneath that instinct, something new was stirring, something that felt suspiciously like the beginning of trust, or perhaps something even more dangerous than that. "I would like that," she said quietly, and watched surprise and something warmer flicker across Kaylin's face, before he offered her a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him since the night everything began to change. As she returned to her chambers that evening, Alara found herself replaying the conversation over and over, marveling at how strange it felt to have spoken aloud after 8 years of silence, and how much stranger it felt that the first person to hear her true voice in nearly a decade was a man whose reputation had once terrified her, and who now seemed to be the only person in her entire pack she could trust with the truth of who she really was. But even as hope bloomed cautiously in her chest, she could not shake the unease that lingered beneath it. Someone in her pack had watched her closely enough to see through her disguise. Someone had decided her voice was dangerous enough to warrant death, and until she and Kaylin discovered who that person was, every step toward trust and toward the truth carried her further into danger she was only beginning to understand. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to Alara's life, one built around careful conversations with Kaylin in the quiet hours after the pack house settled for the evening, and a growing awareness that she was no longer entirely invisible within her own community. Word had spread, as word always does, in a pack bound tightly by shared senses and shared history, that the silent kitchen girl had been moved to the guest chambers near the Alpha King's own quarters, and that she now took her meals with him more often than not. The whispers grew louder with each passing day, though Alara had grown skilled over the years at pretending not to hear them, a skill that now served a different purpose than the one for which she had originally developed it. She heard the kitchen girls speculating in hushed voices about whether the Alpha King had chosen her as his mate, heard the older pack members debating whether it was appropriate for a man of his standing to show such obvious interest in someone with no status, no family connections of importance, no voice with which to defend herself against the growing attention. She tried not to let the whispers trouble her, but some nights, lying awake in the unfamiliar comfort of the guest chambers, she found herself wondering whether she had traded one kind of danger for another. Silence had kept her safe from being claimed against her will for 8 years. Now here she was, drawing closer to the most powerful alpha in the territory, and though he had promised never to force anything upon her, she could not entirely silence the small voice of fear that whispered how easily promises could be broken by those who held all the power in a relationship. It was on one such restless night that she found herself wandering the packhouse corridors long after the household had gone quiet, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep. She moved carefully, avoiding the guards who patrolled certain hallways, drawn by some instinct she could not fully explain, toward the library at the far end of the West Wing, a room she had passed many times over the years but had rarely entered, given how little use a mute kitchen girl had for books she was never expected to discuss with anyone. The library was dark except for a single lamp burning near the far window, and Alara nearly turned back upon realizing the room was already occupied. But something made her pause in the doorway, and in the dim light, she recognized the broad shoulders and familiar dark hair of Kalen, seated at a table covered with old maps and yellowed documents, his expression tight with concentration, and something that looked very much like frustration. He looked up at the sound of her hesitant footstep, and his expression softened immediately. "Alara, I did not expect anyone else to be awake at this hour." "I could not sleep," she admitted, her voice still carrying the slight rasp of disuse, though it grew steadier and more familiar to her own ears with every conversation. "What are you working on?" Kalen gestured to the chair across from him, and she moved to sit, curiosity overtaking her earlier hesitation. "Trying to understand who might have known enough about your past to send someone after you," he said, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "I have been going through old records, correspondence between packs, anything that might connect someone here, to the pack you left 8 years ago. So far, I have found nothing conclusive." Alara studied the scattered documents with growing interest, and before she quite realized what she was doing, she reached for one of the papers nearest to her, scanning the careful handwriting with the same quiet attention she had once given to overheard conversations she was never meant to understand. "This is a trade agreement," she said softly, "between our pack and the Ashwood territory. I recognize some of these names. My family had dealings with Ashwood before we relocated." Kalen's eyes sharpened with interest. "Ashwood," he repeated slowly. "That name has come up twice now in my investigation, though I could not determine why it seemed significant. Tell me more about your family's connection to that territory." Alara frowned, trying to recall details from a childhood she had spent years trying to forget. "My father traded goods with several packs before we settled here. Ashwood was one of our regular partners, though I remember very little about the specific people involved. I was young, and my parents kept most of their business dealings private." "Are your parents still living?" Kalen asked gently, aware of how delicate such questions could be, for someone who had already revealed so much painful history. Alara shook her head. "They passed several years ago, within a season of each other. Illness took my mother first, and I believe my father simply lost the will to continue without her. I have no other family, which is part of why I was able to remain so unremarkable within the pack for so long. No one had reason to inquire deeply into my circumstances." Kalen was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that held both sympathy and something more calculating, the mind of a leader working through a puzzle even as his heart clearly ached for the losses she described so simply. "I am sorry for your losses," he said finally. "But if your family had dealings with Ashwood, and if someone from that territory somehow learned the truth about your voice, it might explain how information about you traveled beyond the boundaries of your childhood pack, into hands that would use it against you now." The pieces began to click together in Alara's mind with unsettling clarity. You believe someone from Ashwood recognized me, despite the years and the change of territory, and either told someone here what they knew, or came here themselves to act on it. It is possible, Kaelin said carefully, though I do not yet have proof of anything. I would rather investigate quietly than raise alarms based on speculation alone. He paused, studying the scattered documents with renewed determination. Would you be willing to help me search through these records? Your memory of names and details from that time might reveal connections I would otherwise miss entirely. Alara nodded, grateful for a way to actively participate in unraveling the mystery that had upended her carefully controlled life, rather than simply waiting in the guest chambers for danger to find her again. Together, they worked through the remainder of the night, Kaelin reading aloud from various documents, while Alara offered what fragments of memory she could recall, piecing together a picture that grew more troubling with each new detail. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the library windows, they had identified a name that appeared repeatedly across several old trade documents. A merchant named Callum Ashford, who had conducted extensive business with Alara's father in the years before her family relocated, and who, according to a more recent correspondence Kaelin located near the bottom of the pile, had relocated himself to their current territory nearly 2 years ago, establishing himself as a trusted advisor within the Pack Council. Callum Ashford, Alara murmured, the name stirring something uncomfortable in her memory, though she could not immediately place why. I know that name. I believe he visited our home once or twice when I was very young, before everything happened. I do not remember much about him directly, only that my father seemed uneasy in his presence, though I never understood why at the time. He has been advising the Pack Council for nearly 2 years, Kaelin said grimly, with no one questioning his history closely enough to connect him to your family's past. If he recognized you when he arrived, and if he has some reason to want you silenced permanently, it would explain a great deal about the timing of this attack. Alara felt a chill settle over her, despite the growing warmth of the morning sun. What reason could he possibly have to want me dead? I was a child when he knew my family. I have no memory of any conflict between us. I do not know yet, Kaelin admitted, but I intend to find out, carefully, and without alerting him to our suspicions, before I have proof strong enough to act upon. In the meantime, I want you to avoid him entirely, if you encounter him within the pack house. Do not let him know that we suspect any connection between him and the attack against you. Alara agreed, though the knowledge that a man from her distant past now walked freely within her own pack, potentially responsible for the attempt on her life, settled uneasily in her stomach for the remainder of the day. She returned to her chambers as the household began to wake, exhausted from the sleepless night, but grateful, in some strange way, for the sense of purpose that had come from working alongside Kaelin to uncover the truth. Over the following days, she found herself paying closer attention to the Pack Council members she encountered during her limited movements through the pack house, searching each unfamiliar face for some hint of recognition, some sign that she had finally identified the man behind the growing danger she faced. She saw him for the first time 3 days later, in a corridor near the council chambers, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and sharp, assessing eyes that lingered on her a moment too long as she passed. Something in his gaze sent a jolt of fear through her, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, her steps steady, betraying nothing of the recognition that flickered uncertainly at the edges of her memory. She did not know for certain that this was Callum Ashford, but some instinct, honed by years of reading rooms and people without the benefit of speech, told her that this man was dangerous, and that his interest in her was far from casual. She reported the encounter to Kaelin that evening, describing the man in careful detail, and watched his expression darken with confirmation. That matches the description I have gathered of Ashford, he said grimly. I want you to be especially careful going forward. If he suspects that we are investigating him, he may grow desperate, and desperate men are often the most dangerous. Alara nodded, though the growing web of danger surrounding her felt increasingly suffocating, a far cry from the simple, controlled invisibility she had maintained for 8 years, before Kaelin's arrival had upended everything she thought she understood about her own safety. She thought often, in these uncertain days, of the choice she had made as a frightened child, the promise to herself that silence would protect her from ever being forced into a fate she did not choose. Now, faced with the terrifying possibility that her silence had never truly protected her at all, that danger had found her regardless of every careful precaution she had taken, she began to wonder whether the walls she had built around herself had ever been anything more than an illusion of safety, one that had finally, inevitably, begun to crumble under the weight of secrets too heavy for silence alone to carry. 2 weeks passed with careful, quiet investigation, and in that time, something shifted between Alara and Kaylin that neither of them spoke of directly, though both seemed acutely aware of its presence. Their evening meetings in the library became a regular occurrence, ostensibly focused on unraveling the mystery of Callum Ashford's true intentions, but increasingly filled with conversations that had little to do with the investigation at all. Alara found herself speaking more freely with each passing day, her voice growing stronger, more natural, until the rasping unfamiliarity of those first tentative words had faded into something that felt, astonishingly, like her own voice again. She told Kaylin about small memories from her childhood, moments of happiness before everything changed, the sound of her mother humming while she worked, the way her father used to carry her on his shoulders through the market square. She had not allowed herself to think of these memories in years, had buried them alongside her voice, afraid that remembering happiness would only make her current isolation more painful to bear. Kaylin listened to every word with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, truly seen. He shared pieces of his own history in return, the weight of leadership thrust upon him at a young age when his father fell in battle, the loneliness of a position that demanded constant strength and left little room for vulnerability. He told her, one evening as rain fell softly against the library windows, that he had never expected to find his fated mate, had begun to believe, after years of searching without success, that perhaps his wolf had simply been mistaken about the existence of such a bond. "And then you broke through my window," Alara said softly, a small smile touching her lips for what felt like the first time in years. "And then I broke through your window," Kaylin agreed, returning her smile with a warmth that made her chest tighten, with feelings she was only beginning to understand. "My wolf recognized you before I did. I felt it the moment I crossed the threshold, this overwhelming certainty that I had found something I had been searching for my entire life, even though I did not yet know your name." Alara looked away, uncertain how to respond to such an admission, though she could not deny the way her own heart responded to his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that felt both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. She had spent 8 years avoiding exactly this kind of connection, terrified of what it might mean to matter enough to someone that her voice, her choices, her very existence, might become a target for control rather than a source of safety. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully, choosing her words with the same deliberation she had once applied to her silence. "I am not opposed to what seems to be growing between us, but I have spent 8 years protecting my own agency, my own right to choose. If we are to move forward, I need to know that choice will always remain mine, that my voice, when I finally reclaim it fully before the entire pack, will not become something used to control me, the way I watched happen to another girl so many years ago." Kaylin's expression grew serious, and he reached across the table to take her hand gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not. "I promise you," he said, his voice steady with conviction, "that I will never take from you what you do not offer freely. Whatever bond exists between us, whatever the future holds, your voice and your choices will always belong to you alone. I have seen enough of what happens when power is used to silence rather than protect, and I refuse to become another chapter in that same terrible story." Alara felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, and she blinked them back, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words. For 8 years, she had believed that safety and voice were mutually exclusive, that she could have one or the other, but never both. Sitting here now, her hand held gently in Kaylin's, she began to imagine, for the first time, a future where that might not be true. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a soft knock at the library door, and both of them straightened, years of caution reasserting itself, even in the midst of growing intimacy. Teddy, the young guard who had become something of a familiar presence in Alara's days, entered with an expression of urgency that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. "Alpha," Teddy said, "we have received word from one of our scouts. Callum Ashford was seen meeting with an unknown wolf near the eastern border late this afternoon." The scout believes the meeting was clandestine, given the location and the hour. Kalen rose immediately, his relaxed posture from moments before transforming into the sharp alertness of a leader receiving news of potential threat. Do we know the identity of the wolf he met with? Not yet, Teddy admitted. But the scout followed at a distance and confirmed that the unknown wolf carried the scent of a rival territory, one we have had tensions with in recent months over border disputes. Alara watched the exchange with growing unease, understanding immediately the implications of this new information. If Ashford was working not alone but in coordination with an external threat, the danger extended far beyond a personal grudge related to her family's past. This suggested something larger, more calculated, a threat that might extend to the entire pack rather than to Alara alone. Increase patrols along the eastern border immediately, Kalen instructed Teddy, and I want Ashford watched closely, though carefully, without revealing that we suspect him of anything. If he is coordinating with outside forces, I want to understand the full scope of what we are facing before we move against him. Teddy nodded and departed swiftly to relay the instructions, leaving Kalen and Alara alone once more, though the earlier warmth of their conversation had been replaced by a heavier, more urgent atmosphere. Kalen turned to her, his expression grave. "This changes things," he said. "If Ashford is working with outside forces, your safety becomes even more critical, not just as a personal matter, but as a potential piece of a larger threat against the pack itself. I need to understand exactly what value you represent to him, and to whoever he is working with." Alara felt the familiar weight of fear settling over her once more, though this time it was tempered by something new, a fierce determination that had not existed within her 8 years ago. She was no longer the frightened child who had chosen silence as her only defense. She had a voice now, however newly reclaimed, and she intended to use it to protect not only herself, but the pack that had, despite everything, become something like a home to her over the years. "Then let us find out together," she said, her voice steady with a resolve that surprised even herself. "I am done hiding, Kalen. Whatever Ashford wants, whatever threat we are facing, I would rather face it with my eyes open and my voice intact than retreat back into the silence that never truly protected me at all." Kalen looked at her with an expression of fierce pride that made her chest swell with an emotion she did not yet have a name for. "Then we face it together," he agreed. "And I promise you, whatever comes, I will not let anyone take from you what you have only just begun to reclaim." That night, as Alara returned to her chambers, she found herself thinking not of fear, but of the strange, unexpected sense of purpose that had settled over her in recent weeks. For 8 years, her life had been defined by absence, by the careful erasure of her own presence from the world around her. Now, standing on the edge of danger greater than anything she had previously imagined, she felt more present, more fully herself, than she had in longer than she could remember. She did not yet know what Callum Ashford wanted, or what threat loomed on the eastern border, or how deeply her own past connected to dangers that now threatened her entire pack. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would face whatever came next, with her voice fully her own, refusing ever again to let silence be the price of her safety. Outside her window, the rain had finally stopped, and the first stars of the evening began to emerge through breaking clouds, distant points of light that seemed, for the first time in years, to promise something other than the isolation she had grown so accustomed to enduring alone. The eastern border remained quiet for several tense days following the scouts' report, though the pack's patrols doubled in number and vigilance, and Kalen's usual composure grew increasingly strained beneath the weight of a threat he could sense but not yet fully see. Alara spent these days assisting where she could, her renewed voice proving useful in council meetings, where her memories of her family's old trade connections helped identify additional names and territories that might be connected to Ashford's suspicious activities. The pack council members reacted to her presence with a mixture of surprise and curiosity, many of them realizing for the first time that the quiet kitchen girl they had overlooked for years possessed both a voice and a sharp memory for detail that proved genuinely valuable to their investigation. Alara found herself, for the first time in her adult life, being asked her opinion, being listened to when she spoke, being treated as someone whose contributions mattered rather than someone whose presence was simply tolerated. It was a strange, disorienting kind of freedom, one she was still learning to navigate. She caught herself sometimes, mid-conversation, instinctively reaching for the silence that had protected her for so long, before remembering that she no longer needed to hide, that the very voice she had suppressed for 8 years was now being welcomed, valued, even sought after by the pack around her. Callum Ashford, for his part, seemed unaware that suspicion had fallen upon him, continuing his role as council advisor with the same calm, measured demeanor he had always displayed. Ilara avoided him carefully whenever their paths crossed, though she noticed, with growing unease, that his eyes still lingered on her longer than seemed casual, a predatory patience in his gaze that made her skin crawl despite her outward composure. It was on the 7th evening after the scouts' report that everything changed. Ilara had just finished a late meeting with several council members regarding trade routes that might connect to the rival territory Ashford had allegedly met with, when Teddy found her in the corridor outside the council chambers, his expression tight with barely contained alarm. "Ilara," he said quickly, "the Alpha needs you in his study immediately. We have received urgent word." She followed him without hesitation, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination, as she hurried through the familiar corridors toward Kalen's study. She found him standing over a large map spread across his desk, several senior pack members gathered around him, their expressions grim in the flickering candlelight. "What has happened?" Ilara asked, moving to stand beside Kalen, who glanced at her with an expression that held both relief at her presence and deep concern for whatever news had prompted this urgent gathering. "Our scouts intercepted a message meant for Ashford," Kalen said grimly, gesturing to a piece of parchment lying on the desk. "It confirms our suspicions. He has been coordinating with the rival territory for months, feeding them information about our pack's defenses and resources, in exchange for a promise of leadership within their territory, once they succeed in weakening us enough to invade." Ilara felt a chill settle over her as she processed this information. "And my family's connection to him? Why does he want me dead specifically, if his true goal is a larger conspiracy against the pack?" Kalen's expression grew even more troubled. "The message mentions you directly, Ilara. It seems your father, before his passing, discovered evidence of Ashford's earlier dealings with the same rival territory, dealings that predate his arrival here by many years. Your father apparently threatened to expose him, which is likely why your family relocated so suddenly when you were young. Ashford has believed, apparently, that your father might have shared that evidence with you before his death, evidence that could expose his long history of betrayal, if it ever surfaced." Ilara's mind raced back through fragmented childhood memories, trying to recall anything her father might have said or shown her before his passing that could relate to such evidence. She remembered nothing specific, only vague impressions of her father's occasional worry, conversations conducted in hushed tones that she had been too young to fully understand at the time. "I have no memory of any evidence," she said slowly. "If my father possessed something that could expose Ashford, he never shared it with me directly. I do not know where such evidence might be, if it even still exists after all these years." "Ashford does not know that," Kalen said grimly. "He has spent years believing you might pose a threat to his position, watching for any sign that you might reveal something dangerous to him. Your silence, ironically, likely convinced him for years that you posed no immediate threat, that whatever you knew remained safely locked away behind your chosen muteness. But something recently must have changed his assessment, prompting him to act now rather than continue waiting." Ilara thought back over recent weeks, searching for anything that might have alerted Ashford to a change in her circumstances. "The attack happened shortly after you arrived, and began investigating the territory more closely," she realized slowly. Perhaps he grew nervous that increased scrutiny from a new Alpha King might eventually uncover his past, and he decided to eliminate any potential loose ends before that scrutiny reached him directly. "That aligns with what we know," Kalen agreed, "which means our investigation itself may have accelerated the danger you faced, even before we understood the full scope of what we were investigating." He turned to the assembled council members, his expression hardening with resolve. "We move against Ashford tonight, before he can act again, or attempt to flee with the information he has already shared with our rivals. I want him detained quietly, without alerting anyone else who might be involved in this conspiracy." The room erupted into swift, efficient activity as the council members dispersed to organize the necessary preparations, leaving Ilara and Kalen alone for a brief moment amid the controlled chaos. He turned to her, his expression softening despite the urgency of the situation. "I need you to remain here, in the safety of the study, "While we deal with Ashford directly," he said, "I know you have grown accustomed to facing danger with your eyes open, rather than hiding from it. But this is not a situation where your presence would add safety. It would only add risk." Alara wanted to argue, wanted to insist on being present for whatever confrontation was about to unfold, but she recognized the wisdom in Kaelin's caution, understood that her involvement in a physical confrontation with a man who had already tried once to have her killed would serve no useful purpose, beyond satisfying her own need to feel in control of the outcome. "Be careful," she said instead, reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past weeks, despite neither of them fully acknowledging what it meant. "Whatever Ashford is capable of, whatever forces he has aligned himself with, I do not wish to lose you before we have had the chance to discover what this connection between us truly means." Kaelin covered her hand with his own, his golden eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have no intention of losing you either, Alara. Not after finally finding you. Wait for me here, and I promise, this will all be over soon." He left with the assembled council members, and Alara remained alone in the study, pacing anxiously, as the sounds of organized movement echoed through the pack house beyond the closed door. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though the clock on the study wall insisted barely half an hour had passed since Kaelin's departure. She was still pacing when the door burst open unexpectedly, and she spun around, expecting Kaelin's return, only to find Callum Ashford himself standing in the doorway, his composed exterior finally cracked, to reveal the desperate cruelty beneath, a blade gleaming in his hand, as his eyes fixed on her with cold, calculating fury. "You should have stayed silent, girl," he snarled, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness. "Your father should have taken his secrets to his grave without breathing a word to anyone. But now, thanks to your new alpha's meddling, everything I have built is about to collapse, and I intend to make certain you do not live to celebrate that collapse." Alara's heart pounded with terror, but beneath the fear, she felt something else stirring, a fierce refusal to return to the silence and helplessness that had once defined her entire existence. She was not the frightened child who had witnessed injustice and chosen invisibility as her only defense. She had a voice now, reclaimed and strong, and she intended to use every resource available to her, voice included, to survive this final confrontation. "I know nothing about any evidence my father may have possessed," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins, buying herself precious time, while her mind raced for any possible way to escape or defend herself. Whatever secrets he carried, he took them with him. "Killing me will not undo whatever exposure you now face." "Perhaps not," Ashford agreed, advancing slowly. "But it will satisfy me nonetheless, after years of watching you, waiting for you to reveal the threat you posed, only to have my carefully constructed plans unravel regardless. If I am to fall, I intend to take the source of my downfall with me." He lunged forward with surprising speed for a man his age, the blade flashing toward her in the dim candlelight. Alara dodged to the side, years of careful observation and quick reflexes, honed through a lifetime of watching for danger, allowing her to avoid the worst of the strike, though the blade caught her arm in a shallow cut that burned with sudden, sharp pain. She cried out, the sound loud and unrestrained in a way that would have been unthinkable for her only weeks ago, and grabbed the nearest object within reach, a heavy candlestick from a side table, swinging it toward Ashford with all the strength her fear and adrenaline could provide. The blow connected with his shoulder, staggering him backward with a grunt of pain, buying her precious seconds to scramble toward the study door. But before she could reach it, the door burst open from the outside, with familiar explosive force, and Kaelin appeared, his eyes blazing gold with barely contained fury, as he took in the scene before him, Ashford recovering his balance with the blade still gripped in his hand, Alara bleeding from a shallow wound, but standing her ground with fierce determination. What followed happened almost too quickly for Alara to fully process. Kaelin crossed the distance between them with impossible speed, disarming Ashford with brutal efficiency before the older man could react, pinning him against the study wall with a grip that left no room for further resistance. Additional pack members poured into the room moments later, securing Ashford fully, as Kaelin turned immediately to Alara, his expression shifting from fury to deep concern as he took in the blood staining her sleeve. "You are hurt," he said, moving to her side instantly, his hands gentle, despite the barely contained tension still radiating from his powerful frame. "I am all right," Ilara assured him, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "It is a shallow cut. I will heal." Kalen pulled her carefully into his arms, and she allowed herself, for the first time since the confrontation began, to fully feel the fear she had been holding at bay, her body trembling against his solid warmth, as the reality of how close she had come to death finally settled over her. "I should never have left you alone," Kalen murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I am sorry, Ilara. I promised to keep you safe, and I failed you."
"You did not fail me," she said firmly, pulling back slightly to meet his eyes. "I am the one who fought back, who refused to let silence be my only defense this time. We faced this together, Kalen, exactly as we said we would."
As the guards led a restrained and defeated Ashford from the study, and pack healers arrived to tend to Ilara's minor wound, she felt something settle within her that had been absent for 8 long years, a sense of hard-won safety that had nothing to do with silence or invisibility, and everything to do with finally standing fully in her own truth, her own voice, her own strength, with someone beside her who valued exactly that. In the weeks following Ashford's capture, the pack settled into a season of careful rebuilding, as council members worked to untangle the full scope of his betrayal and to repair relationships with neighboring territories who had unknowingly been drawn into his schemes. Ilara's shallow wound healed quickly under the attentive care of Marla and the pack healers, leaving only a thin scar along her forearm, as a reminder of how close danger had come, before finally being resolved. Ashford himself confessed everything under formal questioning, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely once his schemes had been fully exposed. He revealed the extent of his dealings with the rival territory, information that allowed Kalen and his council to strengthen their defenses and diplomatic relationships in ways that would protect the pack for years to come. He also confirmed, with bitter resignation, that Ilara's father had indeed possessed evidence of his earlier betrayals decades ago, evidence that had likely been destroyed or lost in the years since her family's relocation. Information that meant nothing now, except as confirmation of the truth Ilara had always sensed but never fully understood. The Pack Council convened a formal hearing to determine Ashford's fate, a lengthy and serious proceeding that Ilara attended at Kalen's request, though she remained largely a silent observer throughout the process, her testimony regarding her family's history providing important context, without requiring her to relive the trauma of the attack in exhaustive detail. In the end, Ashford was stripped of his position and exiled from the territory permanently, a consequence that satisfied the pack's need for justice while avoiding further violence that might have complicated relationships with neighboring packs already unsettled by revelations of his betrayal. With the immediate danger resolved, Ilara found herself facing a different kind of uncertainty, one that had nothing to do with external threats, and everything to do with the internal question of who she wanted to become, now that the crisis that had defined recent weeks had finally passed. She was no longer the silent kitchen girl who had spent 8 years making herself invisible, but she was not yet entirely certain what shape her new, voiced existence should take. She found herself spending most evenings with Kalen, their conversations in the library becoming less about investigation and more about simply understanding each other, sharing thoughts and dreams and fears that had nothing to do with immediate danger, and everything to do with two people slowly, carefully, falling in love. Ilara had never expected to feel this way about anyone, had believed for so long that love and safety were incompatible for someone in her position, that any deep connection would inevitably lead to the same loss of control she had witnessed as a child. But Kalen continued, week after week, to prove her old fears unfounded. He never pressed her for more than she was willing to give, never used his position or his growing feelings for her to extract concessions or compliance. When he asked for her opinion, he genuinely listened to her answer, even when it differed from his own initial instincts. When she expressed uncertainty about her place within the pack, now that her circumstances had changed so dramatically, he offered support and encouragement, without ever suggesting that her value depended on meeting expectations he had set for her. It was on a quiet evening, several weeks after Ashford's exile, that Kalen finally raised the question that had been growing between them for longer than either had fully acknowledged aloud. They sat together in the garden behind the pack house, the last light of evening painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, the air carrying the sweet scent of late-blooming flowers. "Alara," Kalen said, his voice carrying a note of nervousness she had rarely heard from him. "I know that trust and choice matter more to you than almost anything else, after everything you experienced. I would never want to rush you towards something you were not ready for, or make you feel that any expectation existed beyond what you genuinely wished to give freely." She turned to look at him, her heart already beginning to quicken with anticipation of what he might say next. "I know that," she said softly. "You have shown me that, again and again, in everything you have done since the night we met. Then I hope you will forgive me for asking directly," Kalen continued, taking her hand gently in his own, "rather than waiting indefinitely and leaving you uncertain of my intentions. My wolf recognized you as my fated mate the very first night we met, though I said nothing of it at the time, wanting you to know me first, as a man, before you knew me as someone claiming a bond that might feel like pressure rather than genuine connection. But now, having spent these weeks coming to know you, truly know you, I find that my heart agrees completely with what my wolf recognized from the very beginning." Alara's breath caught, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and lingering caution, old fears whispering even now that such happiness might come at a cost she was not prepared to pay. "What are you asking me, Kalen?" "I am asking," he said, his golden eyes holding hers with a tenderness that melted away the last of her hesitation, "whether you would consider becoming my mate, not through any claim I might make upon you, not through any ritual that takes rather than offers choice, but through your own free decision, made entirely on your own terms, whenever and however you feel ready to make it. I am not asking for an answer tonight, or even this season. I am simply asking you to know that when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will be here, waiting, wanting nothing more than the chance to build a life with you as an equal partner, rather than as someone I have claimed." Tears gathered in Alara's eyes, though these were tears of overwhelming happiness, rather than the fear and grief that had defined so much of her life until recently. "Kalen," she said softly, "I have spent 8 years believing that being claimed meant losing myself entirely, that love and autonomy could never coexist for someone like me. You have shown me, every single day since we met, that this need not be true. I do not need more time to know my own heart on this matter. I choose you, freely and completely, not because I fear what might happen if I refuse, but because I have never felt more genuinely myself than I do when I am with you." Kalen's expression transformed with joy so profound that Alara felt it resonate through her own chest, a warmth that chased away the last shadows of old fear entirely. He reached up to gently cup her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away the happy tears that had begun to fall. "Then let us build that life together," he said softly, "on whatever terms feel right to you, at whatever pace feels comfortable, with your voice and your choices always at the center of everything we create." They shared their first kiss beneath the darkening sky, gentle and full of promise, neither rushed nor demanding, simply two people choosing each other freely, after having found their way through fear and danger to genuine trust. When they finally parted, Alara laughed softly, a sound of pure, unguarded joy that felt like the truest expression of her reclaimed voice yet. "I never imagined," she said, resting her forehead against his, "that finding my voice again would also mean finding a home I never knew I was searching for." "Sometimes," Kalen replied, his voice warm with contentment, "the things we need most arrive in ways we never expect, breaking through windows we did not even realize needed breaking." Word of their bond spread through the pack quickly in the days that followed, and Alara found herself, once again, the subject of considerable attention and speculation, though this time, the whispers carried warmth and celebration, rather than fearful curiosity. The pack members who had once overlooked her entirely now greeted her with genuine respect, recognizing in her not only the Alpha King's chosen mate, but also the courage she had shown throughout the recent crisis. Courage that had ultimately helped protect the entire territory from Ashford's betrayal. Alara found herself, in these days of new happiness, reflecting often on the frightened child she had once been, the girl who had chosen silence as her only defense against a world that seemed determined to take her voice and her choices by force. She did not regret the path she had taken, understanding now that it had, in its own strange way, kept her safe, until the right moment arrived for her to reclaim what she had set aside. But she felt profound gratitude, too, that this new chapter of her life offered something she had once believed impossible, a partnership built entirely on mutual respect, where her voice would never again need to be sacrificed for the sake of safety. As the pack prepared for the formal announcement of their bond, a celebration that would honor both their growing love and the resolution of the danger that had brought them together, Ilara stood once more at her chamber window, looking out over the territory that had become her true home. The scar on her arm had faded to a thin, barely visible line, and the scar on her heart, the deep wound left by witnessing injustice as a child, had begun, slowly and surely, to heal as well. She thought of the frightened girl who had chosen 8 years of silence, and she thought of the woman she had become, voice fully reclaimed, love freely chosen, future bright with possibility. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she faced them now not with the desperate self-protection of silence, but with the fierce, joyful strength of a voice, finally, completely her own. The celebration of Ilara and Kaelin's bond was held beneath a sky full of stars. The entire pack gathered in the wide courtyard behind the pack house, tables laden with food and flowers, laughter and music filling the warm evening air, in a way that Ilara could never have imagined possible during her years of quiet invisibility. She stood at the center of it all, dressed in soft blue fabric that Marla had helped her choose, her hair adorned with small white flowers, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she belonged fully and completely to the community around her. Pack members she had known for years but who had never truly seen her approached throughout the evening to offer their congratulations, many of them expressing quiet apologies for having overlooked her for so long, for having accepted her silence at face value, without ever wondering what courage or pain might lie behind it. Ilara accepted these apologies with grace, understanding that the world she had built around herself had been, in many ways, designed specifically to be overlooked, and that she could not fault others for accepting the walls she herself had constructed so carefully. Teddy approached at one point during the evening, his young face beaming with genuine happiness as he offered his congratulations. "I am glad everything worked out," he said earnestly. "You deserve this happiness, after everything you went through." "Thank you, Teddy," Ilara replied warmly. "And thank you for your protection during those difficult weeks. I do not think I properly expressed my gratitude at the time." "It was an honor," he said simply, before excusing himself to rejoin the celebration, leaving Ilara smiling after him with genuine fondness. Marla found her later in the evening, embracing her warmly, before stepping back to study her face, with the same careful attention she had always shown throughout the years of Ilara's silence. "I always wondered," she said gently, "whether there was more to your story than a simple loss of voice. I am glad you finally felt safe enough to reclaim it, and gladder still that you found someone worthy of hearing it. Thank you for never pushing me to explain, all those years," Ilara said, genuine gratitude coloring her voice. "Your patience meant more than you know." As the evening progressed, Kaelin found her near the edge of the courtyard, drawing her gently away from the celebration, for a quiet moment alone beneath the stars. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, studying her face with the same tender attention he always gave her. "More than I ever believed possible," Ilara admitted, leaning into his warmth. "I spent so many years believing that safety required silence, that visibility meant vulnerability to forces beyond my control. Tonight, surrounded by people who genuinely celebrate who I am, voice and all, I finally understand how wrong that belief was." Kaelin pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his arms wrapping securely around her. "Your voice was never the danger, Ilara. The danger always came from those who could not respect what that voice represented. Your right to choose, your right to be heard, your right to exist as fully yourself without fear of punishment for simply speaking your truth. I am grateful, every single day, that you found the courage to reclaim it, and that you chose to share that voice with me." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the celebration continue around them, the warm glow of lanterns, and the sound of joyful laughter, creating a scene so different from the fear and isolation that had once defined so much of Ilara's existence. She thought of the frightened child who had witnessed injustice and chosen silence as her only shield, and she felt profound compassion for that child, understanding now, with the wisdom of everything she had experienced since, that the choice had been born of survival rather than weakness. a testament to resilience rather than defeat. "I want you to know something," she said softly, turning to face Kaelin fully. "The version of myself I was before you arrived. The silent, invisible girl who asked for nothing and expected less. She was not a lesser version of who I am now. She was surviving the only way she knew how, and I am grateful for her courage, even as I am grateful for the courage that finally allowed me to set that survival strategy aside." "I could not agree more," Kaelin said warmly. "Every version of you, silent or speaking, hidden or fully seen, deserves honor for the strength it took to endure what you endured. I simply feel privileged to have been there when you were finally ready to reclaim your full self." As the celebration continued into the night, Elara found herself dancing for the first time in years, her laughter mixing freely with the music, and the joyful sounds of pack members celebrating alongside her. She danced with Kaelin beneath the stars, surrounded by a community that had finally, truly seen her, and felt the last remnants of old fear dissolve completely into genuine, unguarded happiness. In the weeks and months that followed, Elara settled into her new role within the pack, with a confidence she could never have imagined possessing during her years of silence. She began working alongside the council on matters related to trade and diplomacy, her sharp memory and careful attention to detail, skills honed through years of quiet observation, proving invaluable in negotiations and decision-making that shaped the pack's future. She found joy in mentoring younger pack members who struggled to find their own voices amid difficult circumstances, offering gentle guidance drawn from her own hard-won understanding of how silence could serve as both shield and cage, depending on the choices one made about when and how to set it aside. Her bond with Kaelin deepened with each passing season, built not on the desperate power imbalances she had once feared, but on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to ensuring that no one within their territory would ever again feel forced to choose between safety and their own authentic voice. Together, they worked to reform outdated traditions that had allowed men like the Alpha from Elara's childhood pack to silence those who dared to speak against injustice, establishing new protections that honored the autonomy and dignity of every pack member, regardless of status or standing. On quiet evenings, when the demands of leadership finally allowed for rest, Elara would sometimes find herself standing at the window of the chambers she now shared with Kaelin, looking out over the territory that had become her true home, remembering the frightened girl who had once believed silence was her only path to safety. She felt, in these quiet moments, an overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, through fear and danger, and the slow, careful process of learning to trust again, to a life where her voice was not only welcomed, but genuinely celebrated. She had spent 8 years pretending to be mute to avoid being claimed against her will, believing that invisibility was the only protection available to someone in her position. She had been wrong, though it had taken the intervention of an Alpha King, the unraveling of old betrayals, and her own hard-won courage to discover the truth. That genuine safety came not from silence, but from finding those who would honor her voice exactly as it was, without demand or condition, offering partnership rather than control. As she stood at the window that evening, feeling Kaelin's presence approach behind her, his arms wrapping gently around her waist as he joined her in watching the stars emerge across the darkening sky, Elara felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had finally found not just safety, but genuine, unguarded belonging. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now rang out freely and often, in laughter, in leadership, in love, a testament to the truth that had taken her 8 long years to learn, that a voice freely given, in partnership with someone who honored it completely, would always be stronger than a silence born of fear. The pack thrived under their combined leadership in the years that followed, and the story of the silent girl who had found her voice again through the persistence and respect of an Alpha King who refused to claim what was not freely offered, became something of a quiet legend within their territory, whispered not as a cautionary tale of danger and fear, but as a testament to the possibility of genuine partnership, hard-won trust, and the enduring power of a voice finally, completely reclaimed.